So tonight's Yalaf Nissan, 120 years. Everyone's so excited about 120 years. What's so exciting about 120 years? What's so exciting? I'll tell you why it's a question. Because we're interested in the future, not in the past.
But it gives us direction.
It gives us direction. The idea that in 120 years, 50 years ago, in 1970, Tafshin 72, Tafshin Lamed Beis, the Rebbe turned 70 years old, and the Rebbe made a farbrengen, which the Rebbe was not in the habit of doing. The Rebbe did not always farbrengen on his birthday. It was uncommon at that point. After then, it became a yearly event, but the Rebbe did not always farbrengen on his birthday. The Rebbe made a farbrengen, and Chassidim came, and you could see the film. There's a video of it and an audio of it, and you could feel the excitement. You could feel how energized Lubavitch was. The farbrengen has electricity to it. Even when you watch it on the film, you could feel the love the Chassidim have for the Rebbe and the excitement of the occasion and being together. It's very, very special. It's very exciting farbrengen. And at some point in the middle of the farbrengen, the Rebbe asked for a birthday present. And the birthday present that he wanted was 71 new moistes, 71 new Chabad institutions. 71. And that was considered an awful lot. 71 Chabad institutions over the course of a year was considered so much that it was like pushing the envelope. There was a lot to be. It was a high expectation. And what the Rebbe said at that time was that he wants to participate in the costs of each one of these 71 new moistes, and he's going to participate with 15%, 15% of the Eitzah, which could be considerable depending on what kind of a moisted you're building. And he added that usually when I partner with people on an endeavor like this, I give the last percentage. You raise the 85% and I give the last 15%. This time I'm doing something unusual, and he said, I hope my finance minister, Rabbi Chadikov, is not going to be too upset. I'm giving the first 15%. I'm giving you the seed money. The first money is coming from me, which is, I guess, a way of jump-starting people. The Rebbe asked for 71 new moistes. I'll share something sweet with you. There's a woman who many of you know, I'm sure, her name is Mrs. Chana Pekarsky. She now lives in Crown Heights. She's a Popak from home. They were shluchim in California at that time, in Long Beach. So her husband and the Chavre, there were 3 shluchim all told. How many shluchim were there in Long Beach? 4. There was Rabbi Schusterman, there was Rabbi Pekarsky, there was Rabbi Engel, and Rabbi Newman. That was all there was at that time, 1972. So they all traveled to the Rebbe for Yid Aleph Nissen. And the Rebbe talked about 71 new institutions. Rabbi Kunyan told us once that he told the Rebbe 10% is on California. He made 7 new moistes, which was so many. So the story is that Mrs. Popak, Chana Pekarsky's mother, visited California for Pesach. She was spending Pesach with her children, her married children who were shluchim. And Mrs. Popak proposed the idea of making a mikveh for women in Long Beach. And it wasn't even a joke. It was like, it was so unrealistic. Who was using the women? The mikveh, the 4 Lubavitcher shluchais, they were the only ones using the mikveh, and they went to Los Angeles. There weren't that many mikvehs in LA at that time. It's hard to understand. If you know California, Yiddishkeit in California today is incredible. 50 years ago, it was very poor. It was not even close. And so she joked about building a mikveh in Long Beach, and the shluchais, it was a who cares? No one took it seriously at all. It was unrealistic. It was, in their minds, unnecessary. Anyway, Mrs. Popak comes back to New York. She was then the head of the Sheikh Chabad. So she wrote the Rebbe a note about her trip to her children for Pesach. And I'm sure she wanted the Rebbe to know how much Mesiras Nefesh her children are having. And it was very difficult. Shlichus was very hard. Not that it's easy today, but it was harder then, a lot harder then. And she told the Rebbe all the things that they're doing. And she mentioned that over the course of Pesach, they talked about building a mikveh. So Rabbi Chadikov calls up Mrs. Pekarsky to discuss the mikveh that she's building in Long Beach for women. And she wasn't building a mikveh for women. Her mother joked about it at the table with the other women. But it was going to happen. Mrs. Popak brought it up. She wrote it in her note to the Rebbe, and it became her daughter's problem. But the way she told me the story was that Rabbi Chadikov calls right after Pesach, and as soon as Mrs. Pekarsky hears Rabbi Chadikov's voice, he was her husband's boss. She says, "Oh, I'll get my husband." He says, "No, I want to talk to you." The Rebbe wants to know where to send the check. This is how I remember the story. The check for what? She said, the check for the mikveh. She said, what mikveh? She said, the mikveh you're building in Long Beach. She said, I'm not building in Long Beach. She said, you are. Maybe I'm simplifying the story and dramatizing the story, but that's pretty much how the story went. She says, we're not building a Long Beach. What do you mean? Your mother wrote to the Rebbe, you're building mikveh. The Rebbe wants to know. In other words, he's not wasting any time. He's putting the check in the mail, so he'll put your feet to the fire. Anyway, they bought a building. You know, one of the things about building a mikveh is you can't rent the property. You can rent the property for a shul. You can't rent the property for a mikveh because it's kind of silly. You invest all that money and then you lose your rental. So they had to buy a house. And they built a mikveh. That mikveh in Long Beach, which is now 50 years old, it's literally 50 years old this year, is the first shlichus mikveh ever built. In other words, it was the first time a mikveh was built with the mindset that the women who are going to use the mikveh are not frum. A mamish not frum. Some of them don't even keep kosher. So the mikvahs had to be very, very beautiful. And had to be very clean. I've never been to the women's mikveh in Long Beach. I was on the men's side, and there's nothing to write home about. I can assure you of that. And I think they've refurbished it since the last time I visited Long Beach. But that mikveh was considered, when it was built, very, very modern. Since that time, there have been many, many mikvahs women built all over the world. And for many years, that was the model. That was the prototype of how you build a mikveh in a small community with the understanding that most of the women who are going to use the mikveh are not frum, and they're keeping the mitzvah of Taras HaMishpacha. And it's incredibly, incredibly important that the mikveh should be right. So that's the story behind the mikveh in Long Beach, that there was a joke made at the table, and the Rebbe wants to know where to send the check. And one of the interesting details of that story, which I think is worth repeating, is that the Rebbe wanted the women to run the mikveh. Not just to make sure that the women toivel, but to pay the bills. It's a women's project. The women, I don't know if they sat in on the banks when they talked about the loan, but the building is theirs. And the responsibility for the upkeep of the building, Bagashmis, the Rebbe wanted the women, it's a woman's mikveh, a woman's mitzvah, so it's a woman's business. You know, the women are responsible for the Gashmis of the mikveh as well. That's how she told it to me. I think I'm repeating it correctly. Mrs. Pekarsky is alive and well, you can ask her, but I think that's more or less how she told me the story. So the Rebbe asked for 71 new meisters. He got over 140, which was unheard of. It was a record. If the Rebbe asked for 71, the Rebbe surmised that for Chabad at that time, there was a lot. The Rebbe used to say about himself, "Ich hab grois hasagas, I'm not easy to please." And the Rebbe asked for 1972, that's 50 years ago today, or tomorrow to be exact. If the Rebbe asked for 71 new moistis, how many Chabad houses were there in the entire world? You can count them on one hand. Lubavitch was very small. It was very passionate. It was very sincere. It was very dedicated, but it was tiny. The number of people involved in Avodas HaKodesh and Shlichus was insignificant. And the Rebbe got 71, he got twice as many as he asked for. So months ago, or a year ago, or whenever they started talking about 120 years, the idea was not to make 120 moistis, they're making 1,201 new moistis. In other words, 10 times the relative number that the Rebbe expected then. It's also, 1,200 moistis in one today is probably easier than 71 then. But it's a lot. It's a big deal to make 1,201 new moistis. If you watched last night's event in Crown Heights, I don't know if you saw it, Rabbi Kotlarski spoke very well. And his proposal was, I forgot the number, it was 120 million mitzvahs. And there's a website that you can go to, I forgot the name of the site, which you register. The point is he was trying to articulate, you don't realize how many mitzvahs you do with people all the time. And if you collect all of the mitzvahs you do with all the people you interact with, it adds up to an incredible number. The beautiful point that Rebbe Kotlarski made last night that touched me personally was, he spoke very passionately about the idea of kula zakai. That the Gemara says that Mashiach comes either because kula chayev, we're all liable, we're all no good, or kula zakai, we're all righteous, we're all in a state of zchus. And he said the Rebbe's business is that every Jew in the world should be kula zakai. This was the emotional part of his speech, of his plea. So it's 120 years. I don't know, I'm not so excited about it. 120 years sounds like an end. It doesn't sound like a beginning. It's the people's excitement is exciting. The fact that Anash, that Hasidim, that Shluchim, that Lubavitchers feel like I have to, it's 120 years since the Rebbe's birth, I need to do something to strengthen my bond with the Rebbe, to feel more connected to the Rebbe. That's very special, of course, and very important, and quite incredible, to be candid. But the number 120, it's not tickling me right. I don't know why. It's just not working for me. So I'm sort of scratching the bottom of the barrel. Well, what does the number 120 symbolize? What does it represent? So I just want to tell you that if you look in the Chumash, right? In the Chumash it says, "V'hayu yamav me'av esem shana." It's a biblical passage. It says in Bereshis, at the end of Bereshis, it says that when the Eibishter created man, and he gave them an incredible longevity, they lived not close to 100 years, but close to 1,000 years. And they were very corrupt. They were very, very, very sinful. They really were evil. So the Pasuk says, "V'hayu yamav me'av esem shana." And the days are going to be 120 years. If you look at Rashi doesn't say that a person's life expectancy is 120 years. That's what Rashi says. Rashi says you got 120 years till the Mabbul. The 120 years is not the normal life expectancy of a person. In Tillim it says 70 years or 80 years. 120 years in the Chumash, if you look in Rashi's commentary, and there are other commentaries, I'm sure, but if you look in Rashi's commentary, 120 years is going to be a flood, which means after a person lived either 120 years, one or two things happen. Either there's a flood or you're redeemed from a flood. So this I can deal with. 120 years, after 120 years, it's determined. Are we holding by a Mabbul or we're not holding by it? Not that the Eibishter has to show make Mabbuls, but it's a point at which a person's success or failure is measured. I guess that's how 120 years is the Eibishter's judgment. After 120 years, the Eibishter decides. And I think, but how does the Eibishter feel about the Rebbe? What do you think? How does the Eibishter feel about the Rebbe? So that was a pretty good idea, that one. This was a pretty good idea. Huh? You know that one of my most favorite Hasidic quotes is a chassid from a chassid of the Alter Rebbe. His name was Reb Isaac Homler, Reb Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Epstein Homler. He was a chassid of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek. He was a Gadol b'Yisrael. Had he not been a chassid, he would have been mamash a Gadol. He was a great, great God in Torah and a serious servant of God and a real chassid. There's chassidus from him. Reb Isaac Homler he was called. And Reb Isaac Homler lived long. He was Marach Yomim. He lived a long time. And he used to fabring on Yutas Kislev. Like all chassidim, he was a chassid of the Alter Rebbe. He lived through the arrest, he lived through the liberation, and he lived another 50-something years after the Alter Rebbe was liberated from prison. So we had many opportunities, literally, to commemorate, to re-experience the ness of the Alter Rebbe's redemption. And Rabbi Isaac Homler was a big Rov and a big chassid, and if he fabrang, people came to listen. So he said once that if fabrang in Yutas Kislev, he spoke in Yiddish because Vemina the Rebishter Atevi Gitan. For whom the God Almighty do a favor by redeeming the Alter Rebbe from prison. He says the Alter Rebbe was sitting in jail, and it says in the Siches, the Alter Rebbe was in a state of Ava B'Tanugim. He was in a state of nirvana, of delight, from the fact that he's sitting in jail in the schus of his Rabbeim. Alter Rebbe delighted in the fact that he was punished for the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and the Mezritcher Maggid. The Frierdiker Rebbe says, the previous Rebbe says in the Sikhe, that when the Alter Rebbe said Ayeka, you know the Ayeka story, right? I'm not telling you that story, I don't have time for it, but the Alter Rebbe was about to experience Kalei Nefesh, personally. Alter Rebbe was holding by his neshama leaving this guf from the tainug, from the delight of being punished for his Rebbes. And when he told that officer of the court, the Pnimius Dekatay Javayeka, it affected in the Alter Rebbe personally a shoiv, that his neshama should stay in this world. So the Alter Rebbe's imprisonment was delightful. The only part I didn't like was the 3 hours in the house of the Misnagid. That didn't work out so good. But the 53 days he was sitting in jail for the Baal Shem Tov. Was in the Alter Rebbe's way of thinking, that was a great schus. And he even had Big Day Shabbat. He had a shmata that Friday he would put on his neck, and he had Shabbos clothes. So Isaac Homler said the Alter Rebbe sat in jail, he was missing nothing. Finished. Nothing. He had no problem with Svarim. You know why? He had a photographic memory. He need books to study Svarim. So Rebbe Eisel said, this is the quote, when the Alter Rebbe went out of jail, whom did God Almighty do a favor for? And he answered, La Hashem HaYeshua. La Hashem HaYeshua means God did himself a favor. La Hashem HaYeshua means Hashem is the source of salvation. So he types, La Hashem HaYeshua, the Eibishter made a Yeshua for himself. So you talk about the Rebbe. After 120 years, if 120 years is the time that you get to be judged, is there going to be a Mabbul or is there not going to be a Mabbul? And by the way, even if there's a Mabbul, you could explain the Mabbul to be a very positive thing. It's a mikveh tare and all the other nice things. But what do you think? The Rebbe looks at the Eibishter, looks at the Rebbe after 120 years, says, yeah, this was a good one. This one was a good one. Huh? And he's still bearing fruit. He's still living. This is how I'm trying to process in my mind. I don't, the 120 doesn't excite me. Mashiach excites me. And Mashiach excites all of us. But, so this is I don't know what to tell you. 120 years. What's 120 years? 120 years is a lifetime. What's after a lifetime? A bigger lifetime. So what changes? So like I said, in the Chumash, this is the reference. 120 years, you have time to prepare. For tshuva, for a Mabbul. And these 120 years have been quite eventful. Huh? The Rebbe's 120 years have been quite eventful. Think about what the world looked like 120 years ago. Think about what the Jewish people looked like 120 years ago. Think about what the world looked like today. Think about what the Jewish people look like today. And think about the Rebbe's place in all of this. It's unbelievable. It's mamish unbelievable. It's incredible. The Rebbe is incredible, and forgive me for saying it, Chassidim are incredible. Lubavitch is incredible. Obviously, Lubavitch is not incredible because we're such great people. It's because we're connected to such a big tzaddik, such a big Rebbe. And for better or for worse, we're oiseh dvarei. We do what he tells us to do. And this is our schus, this is our identity, this is our joy. I'll tell you a story, a political story, okay? So if you're politically sensitive, maybe you should censor yourself. A few years ago, there was a Jew in Bar. I heard the story from someone who was a witness. There was a Yid in Bar Park who was now deceased. His name was Rabbi Binyamin Villiger. He lived into his 90s. Rabbi Binyamin Villiger's father, his name was Mordechai Villiger, was a very big chassid. He was a chassid of no particular Rebbe. He was his own guy, you know what I'm saying? He didn't have an affiliation. Before the war, he was a Munkacher chassid, but the Munkacher Rebbe passed away in 1937, which is a while ago. And he never really took himself a new Rebbe. If he had a Rebbe, it was probably the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but the Mordechai Villiger was his own situation. His son was a Binyamin Villiger. He was a Chassidish Yid. He was a big asker. He was a great public servant. And he lived in Crown Heights for many, many years. He lived in Crown Heights and Empire Boulevard for many years. And he was very close to the Rebbe. I think he even learned in 770 for a while. And he was the liaison, he was the shliach between the Kloisenberger Rebbe and the Rebbe. So he says, when I had to meet the Rebbe, I had to wait a year for an appointment. But I had a message from the Kloisenberger Rebbe, I got it the same day, He had an open door. The Kloisenberger Rebbe needed the Rebbe, the door was open. And there was a lot of, much more than people know, between the two of them. So Binyamin Villiger was sitting Shiva for his sister who had passed away. And the whole Brooklyn, all the important Jews of Brooklyn came to be Menachem Mabbul, because he was a very important man. He was a public servant. He was involved in Askanas. And two Misnagdish Rashi Yeshivas came in. They sat down, and they made what I consider a pretty tasteful joke. I actually think it's pretty funny. And it doesn't upset me. They said, what's the difference between Moshe Rabbeinu and the Lubavitcher Rebbe? Moshe Rabbeinu, everybody knows he passes away, but no one knows where he's laying. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, no one knows if he's passed away, but everybody knows where he's laying. I think it's funny. And it's true. He's very much alive, and everybody knows where to go find him. But Rebbe Binyamin Villiger was very upset. He was offended, but he wasn't even a Lubavitcher. And he says to these Rashi Yeshivas, I want to ask you a question. He was then in his 90s. In other words, he came to America before the Friedrich Rebbe, 1938 or 39. And he was a Chassidish Bocher. So he witnessed the change to the Yiddishkeit in America over the last 80 years. So he says to these two Rashi Yeshiva, I want to ask you a question. Of all the Gedolim, all of them came to America, and he listed them. The Satmar Rebbe, the Skvere Rebbe, the Moshe Feinstein, Michael Kamenetsky, the Chassidish and the Litvische Gedolim came to America. In the Lubavitcher Rebbe would have lived in Europe. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe would have stayed in Europe. How would Yiddishkeit look in America today? He says, I'll tell you the way it looked in the 50s. A few Stieblach and Browns with old Jews eating herring and kichlach. He says, and if all the Gedolim stayed in Europe and the Lubavitcher Rebbe would him and do he, how would Yiddishkeit look in America? He says, the way it looks. The way it looks. You think about the Rebbe, I want to share something with you which people don't necessarily process. We think about the Rebbe as shlichus, as outreach. There are literally, with Lee Guzma, you don't need me to tell this to you, millions of Jews, or if there's 15 million Jews in the world, a substantial percentage of those 15 million, a substantial percentage, maybe even, Israel is a different situation. If you live in Israel, you're a Jew by Nebuch, by default, yeah. Half the Jews live in Israel, half the Jews live in the diaspora. Of the Jews living outside Beit Israel, you could say probably a majority. Their entire identity, their awareness that they're Jews is the Rebbe's. They would literally not identify as Jews. They wouldn't tell the children we're Jewish. We're living in a generation where it's not a question if I'm going to marry Jewish or I'm going to keep koshers, or I'm going to identify as a Jew. It's so many generations. And there are millions and millions of Yidden all over the world that their entire identifying as a Jew, that it should have some meaning. And that they should be proud. They should be proud. They shouldn't be ashamed and hide. Is the Rebbe. It's incredible. It's mamish amazing. But I want to point something else out to you. If you understand American Jewry begins when? The first Jews in America came here in the 17th century, right? In the 1600s, they built a shul in that small little state. What's it called? In Rhode Island. The shul still exists on the Yemazeh. But there was not a lot of anti-Semitism in America. You know why? I saw in a census, in 1865, there were 5,000 Jews in the whole country. At the end of the Civil War, there were 5,000 Jews. It's probably understated, but it wasn't a million. Maybe it was 6,000. There wasn't a lot of Jews. By the turn of the century, there were millions of Jews here. By the onset of World War I, there were several million Jews here. They came here very fast, rapidly. Very, very, very quickly. They went away from the pogroms, they went away from the poverty, they went away from the revolution, they went away from serving in the armies of these nations who were busy killing each other because it was fun to kill each other. I don't know what is it? Victorious children were having, what's the word? Words, so millions of people had to die. That's how they phrase it in some cultures. So Eden came to this country en masse. Most of them wanted to stay frum. Really, most of them wanted to stay frum. But they also wanted to live. And, when you make your short list of things that I must have, if you didn't put Shabbos on the top of that list, you didn't keep Shabbos. You know how many shuls there were in New York City that you'd have a 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock minyan Shabbos, Rosh Hashanah, you'd keep it, and then after davening, they got on the train and they went to work. It's heartbreaking. Heartbreaking. Unless you are made of steel. You came to this country and said, yeah, I'm living in America, but I'm first a Jew, and second going to take advantage of the American dream. The American dream swallowed you up. But let's talk about the Orthodox, about the Frume. The Frume. Those who joined Orthodox shuls, Frum shuls, even Hamish shuls, Hasidish shuls, really from Litvish shuls. I'm talking in the 30s, the 20s, the 30s, after the First World War. And then spilling over into the 40s, and maybe even into the 50s. From Jews in America. What was the mindset? From Jews, Orthodox Jews, from Jews in America. Being American was very important. And being American didn't only mean that you voted in political elections, that you paid your taxes honorably. If you were drafted, you served. Being American meant looking like an American. The way you make your wedding, and the way you make your bar mitzvah, and the way your lawn looks. Your material life had to reflect American culture very strongly. And one of the undercurrents of that was that when it came to religion, when it came to Yiddishkeit, there was a philosophy of lechatchila b'diavad. If you do something better, if you do something worse, why do it better? It's only Yiddishkeit. It's not America. If I can eat kosher or glad kosher, why should I eat glad? It's America. If I can make a wedding with a mechitza and without a mechitza, and I'll get a rabbi to sign off on it, why would I have a mechitza? If I can make a wedding where the men and women could sit together, but we'll have a place to dance where the men and women will be separate, so we won't be doing any Avedas, why would I make separate seating? Why? It's America. And the list goes on and on. There was a philosophy. Part of the symptom of becoming Americans was an attitude towards Yiddishkeit of everything be b'diavad, and there was a pride in it. American Jews are different. They're different. They're American. And from people who sent their children to yeshiva, it's hard to understand this. A college education was not about a career. A college education was about a self-identity. I'm an American. This is where the Friedrich Rebbe came in 1940. So before you talk about the outreach, before you talk about the public school children, before you talk about the kids whose homes their parents were going to shul on Shabbos, and the children didn't have a Shabbos, and the grandchildren didn't have kosher, and the great-grandchildren didn't necessarily marry Jewish. The Frum Yidden, the Frum culture in America was first American, second Jewish. Everything was b'diavad. Cholav Akum was not allowed. It was preferred. It's America. It's not treif. Why should I eat pas Yisrael? It's whatever the bread is, Wonder Bread. It's delicious. It's America. It's white bread. It's American. Now it's a terrible thing because it's not healthy, Rahman al-Islam. But then it was Wonder Bread, and it didn't even have milk in it. It was part of if you wanted. One of the biggest milchamis, biggest battles that the Rebbe pushed through was lechatchila Yiddishkeit from people. That everything we do has to be done as if the most important thing in my life is Shabbos and kosher and mikveh and film, Yiddishkeit. And then I'm an American. You hear the stories. You're talking now 70 years ago, literally. And the Rebbe fought with Lubavitcher girls to wear sheitlach. They were going to cover their hair, but the sheitel, old people wear sheitlach. It's America. The Rebbe said about young girls wearing sheitlach, ich will das durchfinden mit Mesiras Nefesh. I'm going to win this fight, but it's going to take Mesiras Nefesh to see it through. This was the America to which he came. The Rebbe used to go to officiate at weddings. You know that, Rebbe? And some of those weddings did not have mechitzas. The wedding the Rebbe officiated, I saw a picture of the Rebbe sitting at a Kabbalah's ponim of Lubavitch, Spitz Chabad, and the men and the women are mixed. There was no need to have a mixed wedding. It was all Hamish people. It was America. And America sucked the soul out of what we call Hidur Mitzvah. L'chatchile. When you buy a pair of tefillin, it's like you're buying a car, you buy the best. It's kosher. This was the shtel, it was a mindset in America, it was a mindset. And you can give 1,000 examples. One of the interesting little stories, the Rebbe was officiating at a wedding. The young Rebbe, officiating at the wedding of his Bachrim. And the Rebbe actually went to the hall. In the first few years, the Rebbe used to actually go visit the halls in Brooklyn. He would travel with a car to the hall, and he would sit at the Kabbalah's Panim, he would speak several sichas, and then he went out to the chuppah, and he did the chuppah, and then he would leave. So they have, in many halls, what's called a chuppah room. And the chuppah room has a roof that opens, because a chuppah has to be tachas kippas hashamayim, right? You're supposed to have it, as you know, we make a chuppah in the street. They get to the hall, and the door that opens up to allow the chuppah to be under the sky is broken. The skylight is broken. So they come to tell the Rebbe that they can't make the chuppah outdoors because the skylight is broken. So we're going to have the chuppah inside. But it's okay, it's allowed. It's okay. The Rebbe says, you can't fix it. How about making the chuppah on the sidewalk? Oh, you can't make it on the sidewalk. It's b'chil Hashem. People are going to walk by. Who are these Yidden who are interfering with my passage? And we don't have a permit. And we didn't. So he says, why can't we try? And you're talking not about fringe, you're talking about Spitz Chabad. Spitz Chabad. Now believe me, I'm not speaking Lashon Hara. I'm trying to impress upon you the culture. So some chutzpah bacher didn't ask permission from the Mechutanim. He went over to the owner of the hall, who was a non-Jew, and said, what would you think if we made a service on the sidewalk? He says, go right ahead. So this bacher runs over to the Rebbe, of the Mechutanim, and says, the guy who owns this hotel doesn't mind if you make the chuppah on the side. So the Rebbe laughs and he says, of a guy hat man schnell gepoilt. The guy I convinced quickly. And they were so uncomfortable. They didn't make a permit, and they didn't hang up signs, and they didn't make a detour route for all the people. I'm not saying you have to obstruct people's travels, dafka to be of tzalachas. But there was a mindset in America to be broken. And it came down to being, as the Friedrich Rebbe said, being Jews like Jews were in the old country. A mitzvah is precious. It's not just something that you do. Yiddishkeit is lachatchila, the way we raise our children, the values that we instill. We don't have American values, we have pure Jewish values. Just like in Hungary, Jews didn't have Hungarian values, and in Russia, Jews didn't have Russian values, and in Poland, didn't have Polish values, they have Jewish values. In America, you raise your kids with Jewish values. This was a struggle that the Rebbe fought with the frum world. Today, all good yeshivas are yeshivas. Even 50 years ago, 70 years ago, certainly, every yeshiva was college prep, every one. And I don't mean to harp on college, although it's not such a bad thing to harp on. I mean to point out there was an understanding that if you're not going to have a high school where the kids are prepared to go to college, you're not going to have students. Because this was orthodoxy. This is frum Yiddishkeit in America. And this is a part of the Rebbe's breaking it through. That we should be meshuggah frum. Meshuggah frum, I don't mean overly frum, even though I mean that also, but that our mindset is, I'm a Jew, and I'm a shemet Torah mitzvah, just like my Elta Zayda was in Russia, or in Poland, or wherever he lived, without any difference. This was something that had to be changed in the mindset of frum people in America. I heard the Rebbe once tell somebody, I'm not giving you the history and the context because I don't have time. The Rebbe said, this is the quote. The Rebbe de Shved hat gewollt sehen Amerika als ein Mokum Teire. Und hat das nicht sicher gewöhnt zu sehen. Ich muss das ja sicher sehen. About 50 years ago, the Rebbe said this. My father-in-law, the Rebbe, wanted to see America as a place of Torah, and he did not merit to see it. I merit to see it. But when the Friedrich Rebbe was in America, there were yeshivas. There were a lot of yeshivas. But it wasn't a Mokum Torah. It wasn't a place where, because of Torah, the Yiddishkeit defined us. And it's just one slice, it's one piece. The Rebbe fought 1,000 battles. The Rebbe was involved in everything Jewish. And we think about his outreach, and we often forget the inreach, Pasha. The ashpah the Rebbe had on us, on Lubavitchers, on Chassidim, that we should live our lives as Jews as if this is all there is. In America, that was a big chiddush. It was a novelty. It was for the younger generation. The old people were old, but their children, the children born in this country or came to this country, it was so important to be American. And the Rebbe, he did the chiropractic, whatever you have to do, that snap, click, and it took him a long time. At this durchgeführt. And it had ripples, in every community. I mean, the American Jewry today is beautiful. It's got problems, a lot of problems, but it has a lot of blessings. And one of those blessings is that we're really Jewish. And to a very great extent, to a far greater extent than people imagine, the credit goes to the Friedrich Rebbe and the Rebbe, because they not insisted on frumkeit. They insisted on it should be like in the old country. And like in the old country meant this I'm looking for a word. This ingredient, which is very, very difficult to define by a behavior, because it's not about a behavior, it's a mindset. It's a philosophy that the Rebbe durchgeführt. Anyway, going back to 120 years, so I think David's just pretty happy. This was a good investment, yeah. So there's no Mabbuls. There's no Mabbuls after 120 years. There's going to be only bracha v'atzlacha. I'll share with you again. I'm telling you what's going on in my head, and I hope I'm not disappointing you. About 8 years ago, we had 20 years since Gimel Tammuz. And at that time also was a big talk, 20 years since Gimel Tammuz. And of course, it was compared to 1970, which is 20 years since Yud Shvat. And it bothered me. I don't know how else it bothered me. It bothered. You know why it bothered me? Because the Rebbe kept on quoting a Gemara about Shimshon HaGiber. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about? In Tanakh, in Sefer Shoftim, the book of Judges, you read about Shimshon HaGiber. Shimshon HaGiber was the shofet 20 years. 20 years he was a one-man show, Shimshon HaGiber. Shimshon HaGiber didn't have an army. Shimshon HaGiber didn't have a secretary. He was a one-man. Shimshon HaGiber was a mercenary. With Shimshon HaGiber, the Gemara says, Shimshon HaGiber al shmoi shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu nikra shenemer ki shemesh ha'magen Hashem Elokim. Shimshon HaGiber's name comes from Shem Havaya. He was a godly creature, but he was certainly unusual. With Shimshon HaGiber. And for 20 years he fought and protected the Jewish people, and then they killed him. So one pasuk says, "V'ushafat es Yisrael esrim shana." He judged the Jewish people for 20 years. And the other pasuk says, "V'ushafat abayim shana," for 40 years. Okay, so what's unusual to the Bible is contradictions. But the Gemara is concerned with this question. The Gemara asks it, and the Gemara says that 20 years after Shimshon HaGiber lived, the Plishtim were afraid of him still. So now you're getting closer to 20 years, yeah? So what's so exciting? You understand? If the Gemara says that for 20 years after Yud Shvat, let's speak in our language, the influence of Shimshon HaGiber is felt, what happens after 20 years? So if you look at the Sichos that the Rebbe spoke in 1970, in the weeks and the months leading up to Yud Shvat of that year, the Rebbe kept on talking. For 20 years, the Rebbe's influence continues. Then comes Yud Shvat itself, and what's now? So the Rebbe found a way of spinning it, as he always does. Now it's even higher than before. You're kidding? It's more than before. So what's after 120 years? It's even more. It's even more. Noch mehr lebendiger, noch mehr active, more alive, more active. You know, the Rebbe spoke about the Sfarim. You know, for those of you who have been around Lubavitch more than a day or two, you remember the story with the books, the 1980s. The story with the books was an Agbas Nefesh, was a heartbreak that's indescribable. But one good thing came out of the story with the books. The Sichos that the Rebbe spoke about a Rebbe and the passionate idea of Ma'azare B'chaim, Hu B'chaim, those Sichos are so important. As a seed lives, he lives. Yankov Avinu loy meis. Why? Ma'azare B'chaim, Afu B'chaim. Yankov Avinu didn't die. Those Sichos are the dividends of that terribly painful parsha of the Sfarim, those Sichos. And the Sichos, they still exist. They didn't disappear when we won the Parshas Sfarim. And one of the expressions that the Rebbe used was, first of all, the Gemara's expression is Ma zare b'chaim av hu b'chaim, which means since his seed. It means since us, right? The word zera means seed, but the word zera also means what you plant. When you put a seed in the ground, it grows later. And then the seed that's grown produce kernels again, which can be planted and grow later. It's called gidulim. In time, it's called gidulim and gidulim. Offspring, and the offspring is offering. From those seeds, you have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who holchem be'erchaisav, v'nelcha be'erchaisav, netzach salavad. We walk in the ways of the Rebbe, we remain attached to the Rebbe. So there's a concept of zare b'chaim, hu b'chaim. The seed lives, the Rebbe lives. But the Rebbe said, ma hu b'chaim av zare b'chaim. He misquoted the Gemara, not by mistake, because the Rebbe lives, Chassidim live. And the Rebbe spoke also, one of the expressions the Rebbe said that the Rebbe lives with us and in us and through us to the whole world. You understand? So it's 120 years. Okay, it's time for Mashiach to come. I think we all agree. Yeah. The fact that something actionable is coming out of it is a good thing. But what's 100? Like I said, when I think about this Yud Aleph Nissan, 120 years. This is what's happening in my head. I'm trying to figure out how to explain it in a favorable way. So I said, after 120 years, either there's a Mabbul or there's Mashiach. Ain't from the Beda. I think the Eibush is pretty happy with this particular creation. You know, maybe you have some complaints to me or to you, but to the Rebbe, are you kidding? The Rebbe, what didn't the Rebbe do for the Eibush? You tell me, what did the Rebbe not do for the Eibush? What did he not do for him? Mesiras Nefesh. The Rebbe was a Jew who never for a moment thought about himself. He never thought about his food and his sleep. He never thought about his mitzvahs and his Torah. He thought about everybody else. Every opportunity that he had to think about a Yid that everybody else forgot, that was his first priority. Yeah? So after 120 years, this is how I'm interpreting it. There's a judgment, and there's no question that the judgment is very, very favorable. So it's a most appropriate time for this Galas of Melech HaMashiach. A most appropriate time. A very, very good. It'd be a very good idea if we had the struggle of getting to Yerushalayim of a Pesach. And the Israelis are not going to be nice to us. We have to push to bring a carbon Pesach, and we don't speak the language. But we're all going to have the same problem with the Parah Aduma. There's no more time for Parah Aduma. If Mashiach comes and bring this year carbon Pesach, we're going to have to do it Betumah, which you're actually allowed to do. I guess I got to finish. I got to go down to Ma'ariv, and I don't want to miss Ma'ariv. I had a speech last night. I gave a talk last night. And I spoke to the people about the relationship. These are people who are foreigners. They're not Americans. They've never seen the Rebbe. Never. Not a single one of them saw the Rebbe. And they traveled overseas, traveled a long distance to come to the Rebbe Fidalfness, which is really amazing, right? We don't think anything of it, but it is incredible. It's beautiful. So I said to them, people travel to a tzaddik hundreds of miles. Why? Because there's something in it for them. What's in it for them? What do you mean? This Rebbe gives out brachas. This Rebbe gives out counsel, eitzah. Someone in my family is ill, I go to the Rebbe. He davens for me and boom, they're not sick anymore. I'm having a problem with my parnasa. I can't decide if I should buy this house or marry this boy or this girl. I come to the Rebbe, I got clear instructions about what to do and how to do and when to do and where to do. That's a good reason to travel overseas, to come to a Rebbe who helps us with his brachas and with his eitzah, and even when necessary with eitzah sameifs. So it's a very selfish endeavor, it's a pretty self-serving business to travel overseas to a Rebbe to get the wonderful largesse. You go to the oil, right? The people who are going to the oil, they're not coming there as tourists. And they're certainly not coming there because they want to honor the Rebbe. They're coming there because of themselves. We go there for ourselves. We also go there for ourselves. We all know it. They're for sure going there for themselves. And that's okay. That's okay. Yesh Navi B'Yisrael, Hashem gave us prophets, that we should go to the prophets. Because when we ask a prophet for help, the prophet doesn't say, I see. The prophet says, God said, Koyamar Hashem. Thanks to God. That's the first dimension. The second dimension is also self-serving. I'm coming to a Rebbe, to a tzaddik, to Nasi B'Yisrael. But I'm coming because I want him to connect me to God. I'm coming because I want that he should inspire me to have a sense of the reality of God. It's a much more ideal reason to come to a Rebbe. And it's certainly more of how the Rebbe defines himself, right? The Rebbe doesn't define himself by brachas. The Rebbe defines himself by connecting people to the Eibishter. There's a story that happened here in Philadelphia 90 years ago, where the previous Rebbe visited Philadelphia in 1930. And a couple of boys decided to come to the Friedrich Rebbe and make fun of him. So they prepared some questions, cynical questions on religion. And they came to the address. There was a newspaper that there's this rabbi that came from Europe, and there's many people in line. I mean, the way the story is told, hundreds of people, but okay, if it was 50 people, also a lot. And they're getting in line, and they're waiting their turn. And after being in line, mamish, a couple of minutes, an elderly Jew with a beard approaches them and says, come, the Rebbe wants to see you. They skipped the whole line. They walked straight into the house. They were taken up to the second floor and says, wait. Within a minute or two, they were ushered into the Rebbe's room. When they walk into the previous Rebbe's room, the Rebbe says immediately to them, I understand that you have some questions. Now, the Rebbe didn't need to be told that they had questions. And the Rebbe probably had a good idea what their tone, the spirit of their intended questions were. And they were sort of freaked out, This rabbi makes them skip people much older than them to ask them the cynical, skeptical, scoffing questions that they prepared. So they asked the questions, but with a whole different humility. And the Rebbe answered each of their questions. And then the Rebbe asked them to keep Shabbos. And they did. All of them. And they said to the Rebbe, I don't understand, all these people waiting outside. And we were in the back of the line, and we're young guys. So the Rebbe said, all these people here because they want something from me. You're here because you want what's my business. My business is Yiddishkeit. My business is not all the other things that people come for. So I put you to the head of the line because you have my interest. So there's a second madrega, you understand? You come to a Rebbe, like Chassidim, this famous story with the Chassid of the Alter Rebbe, he wrote on a note, he was 14 years old. A truly lowly soul, how can he approach the Ein Sof? And Alter Rebbe picked up this piece of paper and ran out of his room and left the poor guy standing there. And he said to the Chassidim who was sitting in the next room, this 14-year-old asked a question that none of you even thought to ask. So the second reason you come to a Rebbe is because the Rebbe connects you to Atzma Tzvos and Sof Baruch Hu. He connects you to God. And then there's the third. You come to a Rebbe to serve, to give. Right, we call it Chabad. Right, Tzadik b'menasa yichye Chabad. You have to do our generation. We, our Hasidus, is defined by us serving. And the Rebbe has brainwashed us, has conditioned us to not think anything of it. You know, Lubavitchers are raised with a mindset that my purpose is to help another Jew. What about me? What about me? It's a legitimate question. It's a fair question, but we don't even ask it. We don't even know. We don't even ask it. I heard a story about a Jew. You're waiting for me for Maidav, yeah?
I just want to let you know it's passing through the army upstairs.
Please wait to me. Ich komm schon. I'm not going to keep it too long. Okay. Thank you. I don't want to miss Maidav. There was a Yid who spoke once in 770. And he confessed that the previous Rebbe called him and sent him on a certain shlichus. And he said to the Frierdiker Rebbe, was will ich haben von dem? You understand Yiddish? How is that going to benefit me? And he said, the Rebbe did not answer me, he just looked at me. And if you remember the Rebbe's eyes were powerful. They said the Frierdiker Rebbe's eyes were. He looked through him, he burnt a hole in him. He didn't say a word, he just burnt through him. So this man got up in 770 and told this story, and he said, by this Rebbe, I wouldn't even think to ask that question. Not I wouldn't ask it, I wouldn't even think it. We've been so conditioned as Chassidim that we're here to serve. And it's the highest form of Chassidus. It is. The highest form of Iskasha is not what you take from it, but what you give. And like the Rebbe says in the V'ata Tetzaveh, right? What does the Rebbe say V'ata Tetzaveh? That when we partner with Moshe Rabbeinu, V'yichu Elecha, and we're not just takers, we're givers, we experience a desire for Mashiach, which is impossible without that. Our Chassidus, our connection to Hashem, our appreciation for Ruchnius, for Lakus, for godliness, for spirituality, is enhanced by the virtue of the fact that we're partnering with Moshe Rabbeinu, in quotations. In the Inyanim of Moshe Rabbeinu, it gives us something which if there's no V'yichu Elacha, you cannot have Kasas Lamoyer, L'halas Ner Tamid. This is who we are. The Pashtus, this is Lubavitch, this is who we are. It's hard, but the alternative's worse. Worse than hard is boring and depressing. Yeah? Being a Lubavitcher is not an easy life. It's easy to be above it, I tell you. I'm not above it, I have no experience at it, but I think it is. I have a pretty good idea that it is. But Baruch Hashem, we have a connection to the Rebbe. Yeah, and the most important thing about 120 is that after 120 comes 121 and 122. And again, if my personal mishagas about 120 years, after 120 years you're judged. Hashem Shem told Noach, 120 years and then there's going to be a Mabbul, or not. So the 120 years have come and gone. I think there's no Mabbul. And if there's a Mabbul, it's a Mabbul of, like it says in the Pasuk, Hine Yomim Boyim, days will come in the future, and there'll be a Rov Ba'aretz, be hunger. Lo Rov La'lechem, Lo Rov Tzabal La'mayim, right? There'll be hunger, not for food, but Divrei Elokim Chaim. Okay, thank you all for coming and Akash Nefelach and Pesach. Although sich sein mit den Rebbe, I wish you have a healthy and happy and successful and joy and peace and alle gute brachas. Okay, Akash Nefelach and Pesach. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Rebbe.